I am personally doing something very fussy with this bustle, which is going to add some fun elements of conversation to adjusting the pattern and things you can do to make it beautiful. But bustles are like all the undergarments. You can go as simple or as fancy as you want. I tend to want to make my underpinnings fun, even though I'm usually the only one who will see them. So it's nice. They don't have to be white. They don't have to be muslin. They don't have to be plain, but they also can be all of those things if you prefer. When it comes to my bustle cages, I do tend to make them out of cotton, but a fairly sturdy cotton. So, like quilting cotton rather than a cotton voile. And part of why I do that is because they're going to be under a lot of wear and tear, but I still want them to be potentially washable because I'm going to sweat in this garment and it will be over the back of my posterior, which here in the desert gets very sweaty. So there's always that perspiration getting soaked into the bustle. So I recommend pre-shrinking your fabric or at least giving it a really hot, steamy press to try and pre-shrink it that way if you are unable to wash your fabric. It is constructed in a way where you will be able to slip out the bones and wash it when you want to. I also like this pattern because it is so easy to pack. It is a very heavy lifter in terms of creating this bustle silhouette, but it also is a very low profile garment, which is wonderful because the bustles look like they take up mountains of luggage because of that volume, but most of the volume is actually air. So, that said, let's look at sizing and let's talk about the proportions. I like a big bustle. I want my skirts to be prominent. If you are a fan of Truly Victorian or just, like their patterns because they work really well for your body size and shape, that I like them because they do have this wide size range. They usually are very close to my dimensions, which is super. It means less adjustment to the pattern. And they're very flexible patterns. I find the instructions really good. So I super appreciate that. They are certainly not the only place to get 19th century patterns, but they are one of the better places. If you are making this bustle cage, the ultimate goal is to put a skirt over it. And this is this foundation skirt I normally use for my bustles. And I just wanted to mention that because up after this class, I'm probably going to do a skirt with you all, and this will almost certainly be the one I do. But you should be thinking about the skirt you want to put over your bustle cage. That is going to inspire the dimensions of your bustle. So for this one, I find that it works really well with the larger size, and I'm able to adjust it to accommodate that larger size. But as it's drafted, it's really good for just over the standard regular size rather than the big conquering bustle. So keep that in mind. If you're like, ooh, I don't know if I want my bustle to be too large. I don't want to draw that much attention to my posterior. Please remember that the bustle is there to hypnotize people. It's meant to be large. And there is nothing wrong with that. So,
I
yes,
have a
Martha.
question. Sorry.
Yeah.
Speaking of technical difficulties, my computer just uh, uh, lost the internet connection and came back just as you were holding up that pattern. That
Oh,
the skirt pattern is the one that I always use. I was reading the pattern for the bustle, and it said that you might have to make your skirt like 6 to 8 inches longer in the back. Is that what
mhm.
you find?
Yes.
Okay, that
Yes.
was my question.
Yes. So, and part of the reason why I'm excited to like go from the bustle cage into the skirt is because of those kinds of little fiddly things that are are easy enough to do, but if you've never made the bustle cage and then the skirt, you may not know to make those adjustments. And also I'm going to be making a skirt, and I like just taking you guys along on the adventure. So, but that is the pattern. I really like it. It's a great pattern. It's super versatile, just like this bustle cage. So when you are looking at your bustle cage and you're considering like, do I dare? Yes, you do. You absolutely do dare. Be bold, be fearless, embrace the bustle. Also, you want to look at your hip measurement. That is the important measurement here because you can always add more darts to take it down at your waist, to make it a little bit more snug at your waist. So we want it to be big enough to fit your hip, and you actually want your bustle to fit from back hip to sort of be side to side over the back of your body. You don't want it to be too narrow in the center of your posterior. You want it to fill in that area pretty well. So if need be, you can also size this pattern up. And the trick with sizing it up is really that you may not be able to use the pre-cut hoop bones that are sold by Truly Victorian, and you may then need to cut and tip your own. I love using the pre-cut bones because it just saves me time and effort, and I really appreciate that. But it's not an impossibility to cut and tip your own. And if anyone needs to do that, I will talk you through how to set that up. Sometimes you want a bigger bustle too. Sometimes it's not so much that you need a bigger size, you just want a more prominent bustle. You can also size up the overall curve of your bustle to make it more prominent because you want to go for a more luxurious silhouette. When you, yes, Joanne.
So you're saying that I need to order this pattern, but they also have a kit of the boning that I should order when I order the pattern.
I recommend ordering the kit. Yes.
Yes.
So
Okay.
I think I linked to it in the original post, but I am going to be reposting with corrected Zoom links. So I will make sure to include the link again for the boning kit. But that there is like a section on the Truly Victorian website that's like extras. And often with their patterns, they will have hyperlinks to things that you might want to go with this pattern. Yes, Cindy.
I was actually on their website last night, and there's a link at the bottom of the pattern that takes you to the bones.
Thank you, Cindy.
So I
Thank you.
downloaded the pattern and
Excellent. Good.
ordered the bones because I've got
Perfect.
the other style of bustle kit already. And we're like,
Yes.
oh, we're doing the easy one. Okay, well,
Yeah, we are doing the easy one. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. Captain Azar has kindly posted the link to that boning set in the chat here as well. Yes, Martha.
Yeah. So my question is, I'm just thinking about the typical truly Victorian period where they make you measure your front and your posterior and then
Yes.
choose it that way. So I am definitely front heavy, and I am right on the edge of the largest size. So I don't think like for the back to fit my back, I think it would fit my back. So, but the front maybe I could add some, but I
You
also
could,
am squishy, so I change sizes.
yeah.
So would it be better to have the front pieces overlap if I get smaller, or add a little bit on the end in case I get bigger?
So here's my 2 cents, because that's a great question. The front pieces are these kind of wings that are wrap around the front of your body, and they are there's like a little overlap with the waistband, but essentially they're totally open in the front of your body. So if you're like, oh, Martha, with my hernia, I too have like a permanent prominence in my abdomen, and it's just there, right? There, I have to like live with it, draft for it, adjust for it, and it makes that part of my body more prominent than it used to be. And so my old bustle cages that I made before my hernia still work just fine. As long as the waistband fits your waist. If the little wings like gap a bit in the front, it's fine because they're not actually trying to encase your abdomen. They're just sort of there as anchors to hold your bustle cage in place by wrapping it to the front of your body. And there are even some extant bustles you can see that don't have wings and don't have anything fancy like that wrapping around the front of your body. And they are just like essentially little bags or little, accordions that sit over the back of your tush. So there's that. But when I am making adjustments, I generally just add on to the waistband so that it will be long enough that I can size up if I need to, or I put enough extra hooks and eyes in it so I can make it snugger if I need to. If those wings overlap, that is okay. You might have it be like my darts are not quite as smooth as they were initially, but it's going to be under a petticoat, so that's not going to be noticeable. Joanne, you had your hand up.
So we're going to need a petticoat to go over the bustle and below the skirt. So we're all
Yes.
okay. Just
Yes.
getting
And
my list in order.
yeah. So, I should probably take you all through doing petticoats, but here's as a sort of tangent, because these are good questions. What's going to happen is that because the skirt is something I need to make to meet some deadlines, I'm probably going to jump ahead, show you how to make the skirt. I have every intention of late summer doing a petticoat, split drawers, and chemise as a little class together so that we can go over the complete underpinning set to go with your bustle cage and ultimately your corset, because in the autumn I'm going to be doing a corset class again. So by the time we get through the year, hopefully you'll have all the underpinnings you need to do a full bustle look, plus the skirt. So but yes, you need a petticoat. And there's a wonderful petticoat pattern from Truly Victorian that I use all the time. But you can also always use this skirt as your petticoat if you need to. And just make sure it's a little shorter than the ultimate skirt you want to make for yourself, because you always want your petticoat, ideally, to be a little shorter than your skirt. You may have seen my blue and gold ensemble at Wild West Con. I had made a new petticoat that I really love, and I didn't check to make sure it was going to fit properly under the foundation skirts for that dress. And no one noticed and no one said anything to me, but y'all, a good 2 inches of my petticoat were showing in back the entire time I wore that dress. So I absolutely noticed. So you want to make sure that your petticoat is shorter than your skirts. And it's a good idea to have multiple petticoats because your petticoats, your chemise, your split drawers, are going to be things you can wash a lot, and they are definitely taking on your body oils, the sweat, all of those things you don't want to get onto your fancy clothes, as well as helping to create that silhouette. Now, Cindy mentioned that this is the easy bustle. That's true. This is the easy one. It looks complicated, but it is the easy one to build by comparison to the grand bustle that has all of those ruffles down the back. Now, I love the way that bustle looks with the ruffles, but I don't love the shape of that bustle. I find it a little bit too flat a little bit too squat, and I want a more prominent bustle. So actually what I do now is I use that without the wires to make a really fabulous petticoat to just go over this bustle. So if you want extra volume and you want something really fabulous and you like making ruffles, because there are a lot of ruffles in that bustle, it makes a gorgeous petticoat. And you don't have to put the boning in, and you can just like pop it right over this guy. So that is an aside. And it's also why I'm not teaching that bustle, because I like it in concept, but I prefer it as just a petticoat. And the last time I made one, I wore it as a bustle for about 5 minutes. And then before I even got dressed, I was like, let's take these bones out. I'm just going to put it over my regular lobster tail bustle. Okay, any more questions before we talk a bit more about fit and adjustments, and then get into looking at our fabric and cutting? Yes,
I
Alicia.
assume, because this is how I did the measurements, and I'm sure this is correct, but this goes, I use the measurements based on my corseted waist and hip rather than my actual waist and hip.
Yes.
That's tubular right now.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's correct. You should, I recommend wearing this with a corset. You can absolutely wear it without a corset, but all of these garments are sort of based on the concept that you will be wearing that corset. The corset takes the weight of the garments and helps distribute that weight and provides a nice strong foundation, but it will also adjust your waist measurement. So it's a good idea to know your waist and your corset anyway, as you're going forward into more elaborate pieces of the ensemble. As I mentioned to Martha, however, if your waistband is a little bit too big for you, once you put that corset on, it is okay to overlap a little bit. It's not, the wings are not meant to overlap, but if they do overlap, it's fine. The world will not come to an end. So, that is just a little bit of information about what we're going into. In terms of like adjustments, if you want to make your bustle bigger, if you're like, I want it to be more prominent, I'm ready to live that life, you can see that she has drafted in some points of adjustment on the pattern, but most particular, this adjustment back here, where you can see it goes up about a 1/2 inch per size range. If you want to make your bustle bigger, just to have it be more prominent, this is where I suggest you add to your volume of your bustle. Now, here's the thing. We could get into calculus. We could get into some heavy math to figure out our dimensions. I don't want to do that. Do you guys want to do calculus? No. So, my suggestion is that you measure your bones flat on your pattern. You're going to double this length, whatever your adjustment is, from the adjustment to the edge. You're going to double that length. And then for each bone, you're going to go down, measure it like that. You remember, you need to subtract about 1 inch of length from every bone to make certain that it is not pushing into your stitches at your seam allowance. It's sort of like, for those of you who did corset making with me, it's like the corset bones. You don't want the tip of your bone to be pressing on those seams, because it will wear through your stitches and then you'll have this bone popping out. Very awkward time. So usually I make sure my bones are 1 inch to 1.5 inches shorter than the ultimate length I need, so that it's not pressing against my stitches and slowly wearing through the casing. So if you do adjust your bustle to make it more prominent and you have questions about how to measure your bones, we will address that again at any moment in this class. You can always ask me, what did you say? How do I need to adjust this? I bought these bones. I'm not sure what I'm doing. I will come back to it. You don't have to remember this forever. For the most part, however, I suggest you, if you're like, this is my first bustle cage, just make it to the dimensions of the pattern. It'll be a little easier and you'll get a sense for how you want to wear it. In terms of the other big adjustment, there's really only one other key place that you can adjust your fit on this. We have our wings. Now, the wings, as you can see, again, you've got this little space here in the front. If you need to size up past what the pattern has available, it's very easy. Just expand it the same amount that she's expanded it for every size range, as many sizes as you need to go up. You can see there are 2 places where she has graded the pattern, and those are the 2 places where you want to add your additional volume or subtract. If you're like, oh, I am like very willowy, like a little daffodil in spring, I have narrow hips, then you can also size down in the same way by the same ratio. The other big place where I mostly adjust for fit is in the darts. So you don't have to do your darts exactly as they're drafted on the pattern. We will talk more about darts as we get to them, but these are going to be your points of adjustment for this pattern. There's not a lot of tailoring that happens in the bustle cage. It's not like doing a corset or doing a fitted bodice. This is like meant to be a fairly forgiving garment, which is super nice. So there's one last piece of the garment, and that is the butt pad, as I like to call it, or where all of my swampiness resides when it's hot. And it's just a little, what looks like a rectangle of fabric, but is actually a rhombus. So it is slightly narrower at the top than the bottom. That means when you're cutting out this piece of fabric, it's important to mark the top and the bottom. It will not be visually obvious because the rhombus is very slight. Cake, thank you for being exactly on that piece of the pattern, of course, as cats are wont to do.
Do you find that you have to make it shorter for you,
I
lengthwise?
have shortened mine. That's a great question, Alicia. And so I have shortened mine. You do want it to go further down your legs than you may suspect, but you don't want it to be like tickling your ankles necessarily. So, and this is a great question for those of you who are taller, like Alicia. What can you shorten or lengthen your bustle cage? Yes, let's look at that after we take a little gander at this interior panel. So this is our little rhombus, friends. You cut only one of these. It's very important. The number of times I've cut 2 and wondered why I wasted that fabric is really a lot. So I'm warning you about this now. Just cut 1 piece of it. And again, you can see where she's graded the pattern. These are your places to adjust your size on this piece. I will tell you what, though, I have made it the wrong size, thought I was like different size than I am. I've had to go in and adjust this, or I've lost weight as we do go up and down the scale, depending on what's happening in life. And I think bodies adjust for lots of reasons, right? And sometimes we may not take our measurements every time. In my case, like I have a lot of sense of stability in my size. And so if I've had a big adjustment and this is like just a standard pattern I make all the time, I might not notice and I might go back to my standard size. That definitely happened to me one time making this bustle cage. And all I did was I took in a tuck in the center of this panel. So it's not impossible to adjust this. You don't have to take apart the entire garment if later on you're like, ooh, I need to make this a little bit more snug or shift how the prominence is sitting. So let's talk about shortening and lengthening because you can do both. And I have absolutely shortened these. Sometimes I make this pattern like really short to be what I call the cocktail bustle, like the cocktail shrimp of bustles, because somebody just is going to do like a shorter, sassier bustle skirt and it's going to end at their knees or something. I really want the bustle cage to be shorter than that. Or because somebody's like just putting their bustle on under the overskirt to do a high-low skirt sort of situation. I want that bustle cage to be smaller, less visible in that scenario. And sometimes you're just short. I happen to be just short and you need a little bit less length. So if you're going to shorten from the bottom.
I have a personal question. Are
Yes.
you 5'2"?
I'm 5'3".
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm taller than you, so maybe I don't need to adjust.
You may not need to adjust. When I need to shorten, I just take off this bottom bit and I have like one fewer rows of boning at the bottom. So you'll see there are 1, 2, 3 rows down here at the bottom that are pretty parallel to each other. You can cut those rows off. I do think you want to have boning channels 1, 2, 3, and 4, no matter what. I wouldn't go shorter than 4. And generally, I don't find I need to go shorter than the 5th boning channel, but sometimes I remove channel 7 and channel 6 to shorten it, depending on, again, the skirt lengths and the height of the person. For me personally, I vacillate between cutting off boning channel 7 or not. And it just depends on the skirts and the weight of the skirts and how long my skirts are and sort of the amount of fabric I have, because sometimes being a short person, I can save on fabric by shortening things. And that's kind of nice. So, but if you're a tall person, you are gonna want all 7 rows of bones, and you may want an 8th one. If you're really tall, if you're over 5'6", you may want to add another rung of bones. I have met the wonderful ladies, and I think Cindy and Captain Nazar and Joanne have as well met the women who own and operate Truly Victorian. They're tall. They're 5'8", I think, themselves. So a lot of their patterns are really good for people who are 5'6" to 5'8" because they're already kind of adjusted for tallness. So they're not like, if you're taller than 5'8", you may still need some length. If you're 5'8", you may be like, no, secretly I want an extra bone. So just add that row. And what I recommend is absolutely just extending it exactly the same amount. So I would just mark whatever this distance is below bone 6 to bone 7 and add that exact same amount under bone 7 to do a bone 8. Remember your seam allowances. You always want to add those as well when you are adjusting. Make sure you've got plenty of length to add your ruffle and all of that. Because this is finished with a ruffle at the bottom, which adds some additional length. Another place you can shorten things if you need to is you can make your ruffle a little bit shorter. But the ruffle is not optional. You need the ruffle. It's actually a weight and it is functional. So this bustle cage is like an accordion. And when you sit, it folds up flat automatically, making it very comfortable to sit. It's like folds out of the way. It's great. But if you don't have a ruffle on the bottom and you don't have enough ruffle and your ruffle isn't made out of substantial enough fabric, it will not have enough weight to pull it back down into position. I learned this the hard way. So make sure that you are planning for your ruffle. And if your ruffle has a little bit more furbelows on it, that's all to the good. It's just additional weight to help pull that bustle back into position when you stand. Now you may have seen me do a little hop sometimes when I stand and like a shimmy of my hips after tea dueling and sitting at a table for a long time. I really am like shaking my bustle cage back into position because when I am hot and perspiring, things can stick. But without that ruffle, no shimmy in the world is going to get it to fall back into place. So make sure you are planning your ruffle. Any more questions? Okay.
So I didn't buy enough bones. I didn't think I did, but that's okay. I have spares.
Good. You
Because
can.
I have to add 4 inches to all their skirts.
Yeah, you
4 to
want
5, depending on the skirt.
I think you're gonna want another length, another row of bone than in your bustle cage. I would recommend that for you, Alicia. And you are a tall, delightful human, and so you should have plenty of skirt support as a tall person too. Is very important. So one of the things, one of the tricks I do for myself is I go in to this pattern with a Sharpie and I trace over all of these boning channels with the Sharpie so that when I flip my pattern, I can see them more easily on the other side for transferring my marks. Makes my life a little easier. So I tend to mark all of those with Sharpie. And we'll talk a little bit more about marking as we go into the construction. But this is something I usually do as I'm cutting out the fabric. I make sure that I've marked all my bones. This is the imperial size, and so I marked top and bottom of all of my boning channels because this is the one I normally use. And it's not like it's super visible on the other side, but it's enough that I can see it for tracing my marks into place, which is really, really helpful. The good news is all of these boning channels are straight lines when it is flat. And so it's really easy to trace them out. You're not dealing with any curves, but the position matters. And you want to get things mirrored really accurately between both sides. And for me, it's just really helpful to pull out that Sharpie. It's my pattern, I can write all over it. And I encourage you all to like make the notations and make the marks that help you. So, I try not to destroy my truly Victorian patterns because I do use them a lot, but for many of these, I have written right on the pattern with notes and things to my future self when I figure them out as I'm sewing. And that's just one of those things that I found to be so gosh darn helpful. It just made pulling out my tracing wheel and the tracing paper a lot more effective. And then I wasn't flapping my pattern back and forth to try and like make sure I was lined up properly. Okay. So I decided that for my bustle cage, I was going to make a rainbow, which means I have to take my pattern and break it apart into segments, which is a crazy thing to do. And I don't recommend that as a place to start. But I'm going to talk to you all a little bit about how I'm doing that adjustment Uh, because if you want to do wild stuff or piece your bustle, or you're like, I'm going to use this fabric, but I don't have enough. Where do I piece it? How can I like cheat in a little bit of extra fabric? I'm actually going to use those boning channels as my place to bury a seam to hide what I'm doing under my channel tape. Now, I have done both using ready-made, off-the-shelf, wide bias binding from the fabric store, or making my own bias binding. I'm going to be making my own bias binding for this particular bustle. I do find that homemade bias is generally superior to store-bought because it has more curve and you can make it out of a better caliber of fabric. You even making it out of like quilting cotton is a step up from the quality of fabric they use for the ready-made bias tape. That said, that ready-made stuff works a treat. It absolutely does the trick for this. So you don't have to make your own unless you're like me and you're doing something wild where you're like, I'm going to match everything to my weird rainbow corset and I'm going to go very over the top with this. Okay. So this is not the standard stuff you need to do. But what I'm going to be doing is taking my drafting paper and slicing this into 7 segments for the colors of the rainbow from my corset. And I'm just going to have those slices bisect each of these boning channels. So my seam will be actually under where each boning channel is. That is how I'm approaching that adjustment. So I did not want to like make you feel that you have to trace this out onto any sort of pattern paper and, you know, cut it up and do all this fancy stuff. That's extra. That's just what I'm doing. For me, because I'm a large lady and I fit into that largest size, I actually just have my pattern cut to the largest size and I can just easily cut it out. But if you fall between sizes, or like I also like to preserve my patterns for as long as possible, so I usually don't ever cut them to the below the largest size, then it's a good idea to trace your pieces onto some tracing paper so that it's a little bit easier to see your size and you don't have to trace everything with a tracing wheel. But if you don't want to go through that step of tracing it out onto tracing paper, you can just go in and trace out your size with your tracing wheel and some tracing paper. We are going to be using tracing paper and tracing wheels anyway, so it's a good thing to have on hand, and it's very helpful for marking in those boning channels. That said, if you have a different approach for marking things, that's cool, man. You know, my technique for doing this stuff is not the end all be all ever. So for this garment, I'm using all cotton that I got at Joann's. It's all Kona cotton, which is in their quilting section. It has a sort of fairly nice weight without being too hefty, but you can go up to a cotton twill with this because it is a garment that's under a lot of wear and tear, and that's not going to be too hefty. I wouldn't go into a duck or a canvas or anything like that because it will be uncomfortable to wear and frankly too stiff. Now, hopefully I got enough white fabric for my wings, but if I didn't, I will pivot. I keep throwing everything around, and then Kate keeps lying on top of it off screen. So we're having a real, you know, pattern piece and fabric dance over here on the work table. Okay. And there was a question in the comments. Oh, oh, Alicia says, yeah, drill 40 under French Renaissance dress was a bad choice. Ask her how she knows. Oh man. Alicia, I feel your suffering. Um, a long time ago, I did a Polish hussar coat for myself and absolutely lined that whole thing in canvas. And that was a terrible life choice that I made. So I don't recommend that. Right. If you are doing a lot of different colors or you're piecing your fabric from your stash and you're sort of like pulling things together, you're going to want more than a half yard for your wings. Not a lot more than a half yard, but enough that if you only bought a half yard of a color at Joann's to do a rainbow bustle, it's not quite enough, as I just learned. So I'm going to go grab a different length of white fabric for this so that I can proceed with cutting out that wing, and we can look at like placing those darts and all of that good stuff. So I'm going to be swapping out my quilting weight white cotton for the wings with cotton organdy, which is a very bougie fabric to be using for something like this. And I'm using it because I have enough in my stash. Now, as an aside, I will say that organdy is a wonderful fabric. And so if you have access to it, it's great. Cindy Joy, I'm suspecting you've used it for some of your stuff. Cotton organdy is very strong. It's very light. It's kind of sheer. It's magical. I like it a lot actually as an interfacing for garments that I need to have a certain kind of stiffness and stability, but still be light and very airy and breathable. So that is why I have some on hand, and I happen to have a chunk that's large enough for the wings since I really needed like around a third of a yard, or no, like 5/8 of a yard instead of a half yard for the wings, which is a measurement you can't ask for. Yeah, just like the tiniest bit. And if I were more slender in the hips, I would be fine, but I am not slender in the hips. So these hips do not lie. Fortunately, I just happened to have some cotton organdy that I'd washed recently and was like, you know, just hanging out where I had it drying. So ready to go. You'll notice that the cotton organdy is like a little bit stiff. With a press and like everything, it will soften up, but it will never be as soft as the Kona. So it's always going to be a little bit stiffer. If you want something softer but strong and light and thin, you want organza, like silk organza, which I've also used for all kinds of things, including interfacing for really fancy bodices. So I get my organza and my organdy from Dharma Trading, by the way. If this had not fit, I probably would have started crying. So, it's been one of those mornings where all sorts of weird stuff has gone wrong, which I hate. All right, so let's look at this. Your pattern recommends you have 2.5 yards of 45-inch wide fabric. And it's definitely assuming you're using all the same fabric and you're not piecing and you're not doing anything weird like I'm doing. But what I have learned is that, you know, if you want to do something weird, again, make sure you have more than half a yard for your wings. So let's take a look.
I guess I'll be laying mine out in advance. I I'm using fabric from my stash, and I
Yeah.
have 3 yards, but it's a 2 yard chunk and a 1 yard chunk.
Right. So the 1 yard chunk should be way more than enough for your wings and will probably also fit the back panel and maybe your ruffle. The 2 yard chunk should definitely encompass the back portion of the bustle.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So here is the wing. You can see it fits into this sort of weird little scrap of organdy that I have left over. And you can tell it's a scrap because it's clearly had stuff cut out of it. It's no longer square, but it is nice and clean and ready to go. And it's a little more unruly than I'd like because it could stand to have a nice press. It was just hanging up from being washed and dried, but it has not been pressed. So all I'm going to do here is just like pull out my pattern weights, lie this on the fabric. You do want to check for your grain line and try and have it on the straight of the grain. It will lie a little nicer. You don't necessarily want it to have weird unintended stretch along this curved edge because there is going to be a little bias along this curved edge. But also, this is not a piece of your garment that is weight bearing or, making a rigid shape for you. So if you're a little bit off the grain line, it's not going to be the end of the world. I do love my pattern weights for exactly this kind of project where I want to be pretty accurate because I always strive for accuracy. And I encourage everyone to strive for accuracy. But it's one of those things where it's not a corset. It doesn't have to be like rocket into space level of accuracy. Okay, you'll see there are also some various marks here. You do want to make sure to capture your marks. This is going to help you line it up properly with your other pieces. If you are shortening your bustle cage, you will also want to shorten the front wing, or this will hang lower than your bustle. If you are lengthening your bustle, you want to make sure to lengthen this front wing the same amount. I'm just going to use my rotary cutter to go in here and do some cuts. This is a forgiving enough pattern where I don't feel like I need to trace it onto the fabric and make sure that everything is just so absolutely perfect. As always, I'm using a rotary cutter. Maybe not as always, but frequently I use a rotary cutter. I find it perfect for this sort of stuff. And it takes off a lot of my wear and tear on my hands through the project. This is a style of rotary cutter I've come to love a lot because it's kind of ambidextrous. It can go either direction from my body. But remember, when you're using a rotary cutter, don't put your fingers in front of the blade. That is the way to get hurt. And use the rotary cutter like it's an extension of your arm and hand. So you want your grip to be comfortable. You want your movement to be comfortable. And hopefully your blade is sharp enough that it cuts with ease. This kind of fabric cuts like butter. Organdy is beautiful to work with. It is not a cheap fabric, but if you go to a place like Dharma Trading, you can actually get a fairly good deal on the fabric. It's going to be in white or black, which is very plain Jane, but you can easily dye this. It takes dye beautifully, and white's always good as a base for every color. When I'm using it as interfacing, though, I usually just leave it as white. I don't usually dye it for that purpose. As an aside, if you want a really stiff, wonderful petticoat that is also extremely lightweight, if you want to do really luxurious ruffles that will hold up to the weight of your skirts, organdy is a great option. It's so lightweight. It's like a dream, but it's very stable and it will actually hold up to a lot of weight and maintain a lot of loft. So when I do the grand bustle with all of those ruffles down the back of it, I actually love to do those ruffles out of organdy. So once I've cut this out, I can absolutely go in with my tracing paper and tracing wheel and mark all of these marks. But I don't typically do that. I normally just go in and pin mark, or in the case of these darts, I'm going to leave them unmarked for now because I know that my body has recently changed size and I need to shift where my darts are. So what I may do is construct most of the bustle cage, wrap this around the front of my body and pin in the darts where I think they will be most attractive, and lie very nicely. But I can always add in my darts at a later point of the process. I don't have to mark them now. Just keep in mind that this is intended to have 2 darts. And when we go in to adjust darts and everything, I'll talk about shifting and adjusting your darts. The one thing I will do is I will pin mark my little triangle here on the side, which I'm going to use to match with the back of the bustle. Or rather the diamond. So these little notches in patterns are always meant for helping you to match things up. They're very utilitarian. You can always make your own notches additionally on things. You're like, ooh, I really want to make sure I'm matching at this point on these 2 pattern pieces. You can always add notches. There's no law, but I just like to go in with my pin and find the middle of the notch. And I just put a little pin there. And that lets me know that I need to draw in a notch there or trace in a notch there and make sure that I'm lining these pattern pieces up with the back of the bustle cage. Usually I go in with a number 2 pencil or a Frixion pen, and I just use the middle of the pin to be the middle of my notch, and I draw the wings of my notch on either side of the pin. With the organdy, it's very easy to see my marks on the back side, but when I'm using a more opaque fabric, the pin again acts as my little guide for where my notches need to be. And I can pull out that pin and I've still got a nice little notch for myself, and I didn't have to pull out my tracing wheel or my tracing paper or anything. It was pretty quick. So there's my little wing. Not a bad pivot for, not having quite enough fabric. It's fine. I will be using that white fabric for other parts of the bustle cage, but a little chagrined. Happens. Sometimes we just need to pivot. Okay. So
Sorry,
now
I
my
have to go. Dinner apparently is ready.
oh my gosh, Alicia, go have dinner. Have a wonderful time. Don't apologize. It was good to see you. See you Wednesday, hopefully.
Yes.
All right. Good
Bye.
night. Bye. Okay. So right. So now we go into creating that bustle cage back. And so I'm going to have to do some extra steps with that to like prep my pattern and break it apart and cut out all of these like fiddly bits of fabric. So I don't want to like take up your time showing you all of that unless you'd like to see how I break up a pattern. I'm happy to show you how that works. But essentially at this point, you're just going to blow through and cut out all of your fabric. You'll notice I haven't talked about the waistband very much. And that's because I don't use her pattern piece for the waistband. I actually just cut out a rectangle of fabric that's long enough for my needs and wide enough to satisfy me. So I like a waistband on my bustle cage that's about 1.5 inches wide, finished width, which means I need to have a 4-inch, is that right? Yes, a 4-inch wide rectangle of fabric because I use the 1/2 inch seam allowances like she does. And then you want to make sure that your waistband is long enough to wrap not only all the way around your waist, but for the ends to overlap at the front. So you're going to want to take your waist measurement and figure out how long of an overlap you want to have. If you're somebody who's like, I bloat every month, depending on different things going on, give yourself more length. Like do the adjustment here that is going to make this garment as comfortable and flexible for your body as possible. These days, my lower abdomen bloats and shifts a lot because of that hernia. And so I have to take that adjustment into account with my corsets, but it doesn't impact my waist measurement that much typically. So my waist stays mostly the same. But I've had costumes in which I tight laced and was very like aggressive in my corsetry. And so I needed a pretty snug waist on things, but I don't always want to tight lace. I don't always want to be vain in my costumes. So I tend to have a 3 to 4 inch overlap on my waist so that I have plenty of adjustment if I want to go bigger or smaller on my waist, depending on how I'm lacing into my corset. So that's my adjustment, my personal preference. You know what works best for you on your waist. So, all right. Any questions before we kind of wrap up today and proceed into the world?
Yeah, I had an Olfa cutter that was just like that. I think almost exactly the same setup. And I was so sad when it shattered after many, many years. But
Right. Olfa is also a really nice, I mean, I've had really good success with Olfa, but buying rotary handles at Joann's, they're mostly Fiskars handles. And generally speaking, I have not had any problems with the Fiskars until that moment. And that was the moment where I was like, I'm done. You betrayed me. That was a horrible accident, you all. And it was on my dominant hand, which was a real problem. So, you need that thumb for almost anything.
yeah.
But yeah, this has been great. I love it. So yeah, any other questions or comments?
I have
Yeah.
questions.
Yeah.
So on the pattern, it
Mhm.
says to mark the boning channels on the wrong side. That's because they put the boning on the wrong side, right? So
Yes. Yes. So normally, on mine, not on this particular one, because I'm going to do a bunch of fancy things and I want everything to be visible. Normally you put the boning channels on the inside, but if you want them to be decorative, if you want them to be part of your design, there is no reason to not put them on the outside of your garment. I've done both and it's been fine both ways. There is a minor amount of hand sewing to whip stitch close your boning channels once the bones are in. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but as a preliminary, I recommend putting your openings all on the same side and in roughly the same position. So when you do decide to go launder your bustle cage, you're not searching through every bone to try and remember what you decided to do at 2 a.m. 6 months ago.
Yeah.
So, lesson learned the hard way. But yeah, you can put them on the inside or out, and it won't really change the circumference in any noticeable, or not circumference, the length in any noticeable way. So that bone is going to have to curve into the same shape, whether it's on the outside or the inside of your bustle cage. I think the reason why they generally put the bones on the inside is so that the casings won't be visible.
okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
because I uh my fabric is pretty wacky. I know I
Oh,
had said before that I was doing a rock lobster, but when I grabbed the fabric, it's actually shells, right? So um right, this is it.
cool. I
It
loved
Fun.
seemed
it.
like it would be pretty fabulous to have like a color. Because
Yeah.
the little dark bits are like brown, and it seems like it'd be neat to have them brown on there.
Yeah.
Uncooked lobster.
Oh, I love that. Or a little golden butter, buttery goodness to go with your
Yes,
lobster.
yes.
Yeah. I think that the bone casings on the outside are nice because they become decorative. So when I am tracing my casings into position, I usually just mark the top edge of that boning channel because once I've sewn the casing on the top edge, the bottom edge is going to immediately be where I want it to be. So I don't typically trace in both sides of the boning channel, just as an FYI. We're probably going to do some tracing and positioning next week, but if you are like, well, I'm going to trace as I cut, I only find it necessary to trace in the top edge. But I am very persnickety and try and do my best to make sure everything is symmetrical across both pieces. So one of the things I do is I lay them side by side and I confirm that everything lines up before I move forward and start stitching things together because it's harder to adjust your markings once you have this three-dimensional shape forming. That said, your boning casing is a straight piece of fabric. And so as long as your markings are within a 16th of an inch of each other, it's going to work out and you're going to be able to like zhuzh it into position. But if you go in and you check your markings and they are off like a quarter or a half inch, you really should confirm all of your markings because that's the kind of discrepancy that's going to build up across the whole garment and just make it more difficult to have a symmetrical pattern of bones. And you do want these bones to be symmetrical so your shape is symmetrical and not weirdly lumpy, right? So the reason to be persnickety here is because you want a smooth finished product. So
Okay.
yeah.
I had one more question.
Yes, thank you,
You
Martha.
had talked about hefty trim on the ruffle.
Hmm.
So, but not, I mean, you didn't say not like uh GIMP, but because GIMP would be heavy, but it wouldn't be washable, right?
GIMP. So if you want your garment to be washable, I recommend trimming out your ruffle with things that you can wash. If you decide to do non-washable stuff, a vodka solution in a spray bottle is going to be your friend. So it's not the end of the world if you make something that's not washable.
Yeah.
I don't wash my Bustle cages that often, to be honest. I'm not like every trip coming home and unpicking them. But if I do Phoenix fan fusion in, late May, early June, and it's 115 degrees out, probably need to wash my Bustle cage after that convention weekend because it is gross when I get done, right? But if I'm going to TeslaCon and I'm only going to TeslaCon or 13 Gears or things where I'm not sweating up a storm into my corset and Bustle cage, I may not need to wash my Bustle cage even like more than once a year. So, because it's going to pick up some body oils, but you're also ideally wearing a chemise, split drawers, underneath this corset. So like it's not the first line of defense against body oils. So it's not going to pick up as much. The chemise and split drawers, I recommend washing after every time you wear them, ideally. So, right. But this does not need to be washed after every convention weekend. So.
But you would say the more trim on that end piece, the better. So, because if it's not something thick like GIMP, it should be lots of it. So
I like to put some lace on mine. I have this like ridiculous, I'll get it, I'll show it to you. Like this ridiculous purple lace that I got in LA. No, I got this in New York. And it's like, very thick width. And I'm going to probably put this either over the top of my ruffle or on the bottom edge of my ruffle, just to add a little bit more interest and a little bit more weight, for instance.
But not very much weight.
It's pretty light, but I may double up. So I thought that was a 3-layer lace, which I've bought from them before. It's one. But I may be very cheeky and like double it up so I have even more, right? Or add another layer of color over it, as Captain Azar says, because mine is a rainbow, so I can add endless color. Fringe is great. I've done fringe on the bottom of mine because who doesn't love fringe? One of the nice things about adding something like lace or something soft and dynamic to the bottom edge of your ruffle, as long as it's shorter than your petticoat, is that it will also help to break up the sharp edge at the bottom of your Bustle cage. So we're always trying to break up the edges of our foundation garments so you don't see the bustle line under your skirts. They weren't really worried about panty lines. They were worried about bustle lines. So we're trying to break that up and soften it so it's not as noticeable. That's why the petticoats, you add volume and softness and you cover those sharp edges. So yeah.
Oh,
great. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm jumping ahead because
Yes.
that's what I do. But
Yes.
so the way that the casing lines are drawn, there's an angle. Do we sew it as an angle, or do you soften that into a curve when you're sewing it?
I soften it into a curve when I'm sewing.
Yeah, because that just seemed like
I soften
it made me
it.
twitchy.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I soften it into a curve when I'm sewing, because if you do the angle, then you've got
Well, and you
like
got all this excess bias at the bottom,
right,
and you have to
right. And then you're like
do
having to
something.
sort of cheat that little hood of bias at the bottom into like a pleat or like gather it or something. So I soften it into a like little curve right over that center back seam so that it's a little bit easier to sew.
Do you stretch it and steam it on your ironing board to the shape you want before you stitch it?
It's not
No.
such a drastic curve that I do
Oh,
that. I do that with corsets though. But for this, like the curve just isn't that much. So I may press it as I'm pinning it in place, give it a little bit of stretch and press there. But I only do like the tiniest bit of curve.
okay. And you
Yeah.
pin while you're sewing? No.
Sometimes I don't pin at all because I am cheeky. Also I find that if I'm really struggling, like that little narrow tape that disappears in water will also work a treat for positioning um, your casings. But honestly, Cindy, now that you've called me out, not really, but
Yeah.
I hold, I put my bone casing where it needs to be, and I just feed it in with my hands. I often don't even pin it in place. For class, I'll probably show you guys how to pin, but you should know that I like the cottons play very nicely together. And so as long as I have a nice line to put the edge of my boning channel against, then I don't
I mean, you
need to
drew a
pin it.
line on.
Right. I've got a
I
line.
just find pins annoying at that point.
Yeah.
But
I mean, pins are the enemy. And so, in so much as they take time and they put holes in your fabrics and they can stab you. So
and if you
whenever I
don't pull
can,
them, they might break your needle.
exactly. So whenever I can get away with not using pins, I don't use pins. Um, so I'll show you guys when we get there, I'll show you how I would pin and have pinned when I got started. And then I'll show you how I freewheel it because it's only fair that you see
Yeah.
the reality. But the good news is like you too can freewheel when you get comfortable. But there's like no reason to feel like you have to do it that way. If you like to use pins, use pins. If you want to use 505 spray and like that repositional spray adhesive to position your bias tape that way, you can do that. If you want to use the little like tape to position it, you can do that. So there are lots of options for how to attach your boning channels onto this particular garment to make your life easy. The whole point, though, is to make your life easy because we're going to be doing 7 of these boning channels. And
Yeah,
by the time you're done, you're going to be over that experience, right? I know I am
certainly
usually.
not the most boning channels I've ever done, but
No, no. So at the end of the year in the autumn, I'm going to be doing this single layer corset with external boning channels. And we will all be like, how many boning channels are we going to have to do? Spoiler, many. So, I have like 20 to 24 bones in my corset, which means 20 to 24 boning channels. So, yeah, you'll
kind
get
of a
really good
minimum of
bonuses.
16. But
Yeah, yeah. It also, I mean, I don't want to get too far into that because we'll talk about when we're doing the class, but it also depends on like, are you doing a double boning channel or single, or how are you approaching it? But you'll get really good at boning channels by the end of that class. So this is good preparation for sewing boning channels. And one of the things that is really good about this is you'll get great at edge stitching. By the time we're done, you're gonna be like, edge stitching No problem. I do that in my sleep because Madame Askew is mean and makes me get up early on Sundays to do boning channels.